She erased 40 years of flood protection in less than an hour, and she smiled while the excavator was doing it. That berm had kept 7 homes dry through storms that could turn a lazy creek into a brown wall of moving water. But to her, it was just an ugly pile of dirt, blocking the kind of neighborhood she wanted to control. I stood there with my phone in my hand, watching the bucket tear into the ground my father once shaped with a borrowed bulldozer. And when she rolled down the window of her black Mercedes and said, "Caleb, you really should have taken the polite option," I did not answer. I just kept recording. Because by then I already knew she'd made the one mistake powerful people make when they get too comfortable. She confused silence with surrender. My name is Caleb Rowe. I was 56 years old when all this happened. A semi-retired drainage engineer, part-time orchard grower, full-time husband to a woman who still thinks I own too many measuring tools, and I live on 6 acres at the low end of a place called Barton Ridge Commons, which sounds nicer than it is, honestly. Because most days it is just a mixed little HOA community tucked into the southern Missouri hills, with mailboxes that lean after every storm, deer that eat anything you forget to fence, and neighbors who wave with 2 fingers from behind a steering wheel. Behind my property runs a seasonal creek called Hawthorne Run, and in August it looks harmless, almost sweet, shallow water sliding over flat stones, minnows flashing like bits of tin. Kids from the lower cul-de-sac sometimes coming down with nets and muddy shoes. But in March, when the ridge snow melts and the rain sits over the valley too long, Hawthorne Run changes its mind, and it stops being pretty. It gets loud first, that low stomach sound under everything. Then it rises fast, and when it jumps the bank, it does not ask permission. It goes where gravity tells it to go, straight toward the homes below mine unless something turns it away. My father understood that before anybody here knew what an HOA was. He bought this land in 1979, back when Barton Ridge was mostly pasture and old fence posts. And before he built the workshop, before he planted the pear trees, before he even finished the kitchen cabinets in the first house, he cut a drainage swale along the back edge and built an earthen berm to push overflow away from the lower lots. He did it with a rented dozer that barely started, 2 neighbors who were paid in barbecue, and a stubbornness that I suppose he passed down genetically, because that berm held for decades. I reinforced it myself 10 years before this mess began. Spent a whole Saturday ankle-deep in red clay. My son Owen laughing from the tailgate and telling me I was going to need a new spine by Monday. And he was not wrong. But when the spring rains came, the water hit that berm, followed the swale, crossed the spillway, and left the houses below alone. That was the whole point. It was never decorative. It was never a landscaping choice. It was the quiet reason people slept through storms. Then Vivian Carrington moved in. Vivian bought the big stone house up on Waverly Hill, the one with the circular drive and the copper gutters, and within a year she had turned Barton Ridge Commons into her personal courtroom. She came from money, real estate money mostly, shopping centers, medical parks, commercial land with names like The Point and The Preserve. And she had the kind of confidence that comes from never once wondering whether the room would listen when she spoke. She joined the HOA board first as secretary, then became president after a meeting where half the neighborhood did not even know there was an election. And from that point on, the rules started working differently depending on who you were and whether Vivian liked the look of your house from her hill. Mrs. Harlan, a widow with a tiny American flag near her porch, got a violation because the pole's not an approved finish. The Dorsey family, whose youngest boy used a wheelchair, waited 4 months for ramp approval that should have taken a week. The Meta family applied for a backyard shed in April, got delayed until October, then denied for visual disruption, while 2 board friends built larger sheds in plain view of the road and somehow called them garden structures. Vivian never wrote anything openly cruel. That was the talent. She used soft words, community standards, architectural harmony, neighborhood values, and she said them with a smile so polished you could see your own frustration reflected in it. I kept my head down for a long time, not because I respected her, but because I had lived long enough to know some people are hungry for conflict, and you do not feed them unless you are ready to clean up the mess. Then her brother tried to buy the strip of land behind my orchard. He was putting together a luxury development on the ridge above us, something with gated access and fake rustic street lamps, and that little strip would have given him a cleaner drainage route and a better access easement. I said no, not rudely, just no. A week later, Vivian stopped waving when she passed my mailbox. 2 weeks later, the first letter arrived. It came in a white envelope from the HOA management company, very crisp, very official, telling me I was in violation of Article 8, Section 4, unauthorized earthwork and visual obstruction, and that I had 30 days to remove the berm or face daily fines of $200. I read it at the kitchen table while my wife, Nora, stood by the sink drying the same coffee mug for about a minute too long. She knew my face. She said, "Caleb, do not start a war unless you know where it ends." I told her I was not starting one. I was just going to get the paperwork. That is what people like Vivian never understand about quiet men with filing cabinets. We may not speak fast, but we keep things. I pulled the original deed with my father's name on it, the old county plat, the drainage easement map, and a letter from 1991 where the county drainage office acknowledged the work berm as a stormwater control structure protecting multiple downstream parcels. My father had saved it in a folder labeled Creek Stuff, which was about as sentimental as he ever got. Owen, who was in his third year of environmental law up in Columbia, helped me draft the response. We were careful, almost painfully careful. We cited the county record, the easement language, the maintenance history, the downstream risk, and we sent it certified mail, return receipt. Every page numbered, every attachment listed. I hand-delivered a second copy to the HOA office, and the receptionist looked at the packet like it might hatch. For 3 weeks I heard nothing. Then the board met on a Tuesday night. Vivian sitting at the center table in a cream blazer, hands folded, voice calm enough to make you want to throw something, and they rejected my appeal 4-1. When I raised my hand to speak during homeowner comments, she glanced at the clock and said, "Due to time limitations, public comment is being waived tonight. The meeting had been going for 22 minutes. That was the moment I understood this was not about a berm. It was about a woman who had learned that rules could be used like locked doors, and about a neighborhood that had gotten used to standing outside them. So I went home, made coffee I did not need, and filed a public records request for every board minute, enforcement vote, and email involving my property. 3 days later, they gave me a stack of documents they clearly hoped I would not read. I read every page. Then I posted the records in the neighborhood Facebook group with no speech, no insult, no little angry emoji. Just the documents and one sentence saying any homeowner was welcome to review them. By morning, there were 68 comments, and by lunch, people were posting their own letters, their own denials, their own stories, the ramp, the flagpole, the shed, the selective approvals. The little quiet humiliations that had been happening one house at a time suddenly became a pattern everybody could see. Vivian had spent years making people feel alone. It took one folder of receipts to prove they were not, and that, looking back, was when she stopped treating me like a nuisance and started treating me like a threat. The first thing Vivian did after that Facebook post was not apologize, not explain, not even pretend she had misunderstood the records. She called an emergency board meeting and had me removed from every official neighborhood platform by dinner. I found out because Mrs. Harlan called me while I was standing in the feed store looking at fence staples, and she said, "Caleb, honey, I think they just kicked you out of the group." Which was funny in a sad little way because by then the screenshots were already everywhere. In text threads, in side chats, in the Barton Ridge parents group, even on a regional HOA watchdog page where strangers with names like Taxed Enough in Tulsa were arguing about drainage easements like it was playoff football. Vivian had tried to close one door and somehow opened 12 windows. 2 days later, the fines started. $200 a day, printed on bright white paper with a little payment portal link at the bottom, as if they were charging me for pool dues instead of trying to bankrupt a man for protecting his neighbors from floodwater. Nora stacked the letters in a bread basket on the kitchen counter because she said if we were going to be harassed, we might as well keep it organized. She has a dry sense of humor, my Nora, the kind that keeps you from falling apart before breakfast. Still, I could see what it was doing to her. She checked the mailbox like it might bite. She started sleeping with the lamp on. That bothered me more than the fines. Money can be disputed. Fear moves into the house and starts rearranging furniture. Vivian also hired a private site inspector named Rudd Mason, who produced a 2-page report claiming my berm appeared to redirect water unnaturally and could adversely affect common drainage patterns, which sounded serious until you understood that all drainage systems redirect water unnaturally. That is the job. A roof gutter redirects water unnaturally. A ditch does. A culvert does. A coffee mug redirects coffee unnaturally. If you want to get philosophical before 8 in the morning, but the report had a letterhead, and Vivian loved a letterhead. She brought it to the next meeting and read from it slowly, with that soft, public voice people use when they want cruelty to sound like procedure. Mr. Rourke has chosen to place his personal preference above the shared aesthetic and engineering concerns of the community, she said. I was sitting in the back row because I had been allowed to attend but not speak, and I remember looking at the floor and feeling heat crawl up my neck. Personal preference. My father hauling clay in 1979 was personal preference. 7 dry living rooms were personal preference. A county record was personal preference. I went home that night with a feeling I had not had in years. Not anger exactly, more like a switch clicking behind my ribs. I stopped reacting and started building a case. That Saturday I'd pulled out my transit level, my old survey rods, 2 rolls of flagging tape, and a notebook thick enough to make Owen groan when he saw it. He had driven down from Columbia with a backpack full of law books and the expression of a son who knows his father is about to overdo it. Dad, he said, normal people hire consultants. I told him normal people also pay someone to change their oil. And yet here we are. We spent 14 hours over 2 days mapping the low ground behind my orchard and the slope lines through the lower lots. And by Sunday evening, my knees sounded like gravel in a coffee can. But the data was clean without the berm. Hawthorne Run would not just flood the lower cul-de-sac. It would split, one sheet of water pushing east across the older homes, another flow line running along a shallow contour that led straight toward Waverly Hill, right to the manicured hollow beneath Vivian Carrington's stone house. That was the part that made Owen stop joking. He stood over the map on my workbench, rain tapping the garage roof, and said, "Does she know her own yard is the catch basin?" I said, "Son, people like Vivian know the view from the hill. They rarely study the hill itself. I hired Dr. Naomi Keller, a hydrologist out of Jefferson City, to review my measurements. Naomi was calm, precise, and allergic to drama, which made her perfect. She walked the site in rubber boots, asked better questions than anybody on the HOA board had asked in 6 months, and 3 days later sent me a certified assessment that said removal of the Rourke berm during a high precipitation event would predictably cause sheet flooding across multiple residential lots, with secondary overflow risks to upland road and residential infrastructure. In ordinary English, take out the berm before a big storm and water would go places nobody wanted it to go. Owen and I filed that report with the county drainage office and the state environmental division, and suddenly Vivian's little aesthetic complaint was not just an HOA squabble anymore. It was an infrastructure hazard notice. The county sent the board a letter asking them to pause enforcement until an official review could be completed. Vivian's attorney replied that the HOA was a private body and retained authority over covenant compliance, which was the kind of answer that sounds confident right up until someone asks why a private body thinks it can ignore flood risk on recorded drainage land. Around that time, a board member named Miles Deacon called me from his truck. Miles was a retired lineman, quiet man, always wore a seed cap. The sort of fellow who said maybe when he meant absolutely not. He had voted against Vivian once or twice, but never loudly enough to matter. Calaby said, "I want you to know I kept copies of the emails." I asked which emails. "All of them," he said. "Every message about your land, the fines, the inspector, the vote, and the thing with her brother." I sat down when he said that. There are moments in a fight when you realize you are not alone. But more importantly, the other side does not know you are not alone. I told Miles to keep everything and not say a word. Vivian, meanwhile, decided facts were inconvenient, so she went after character. At a spring wine social up on the hill, she told people I was exploiting the creek to increase my property value. She said I had a long history of being difficult, which was impressive since our longest conversation before all this had been about trash picker. Then she sent a letter on HOA stationery to the civil engineering firm where I still consulted part-time, implying I was misusing my credentials in a neighborhood dispute. My supervisor Pete called me and said, "Caleb, I have read this letter 3 times, and I still cannot figure out what she thinks you did wrong." I laughed because if I did not laugh, I might have driven up the hill and said something that would have felt good for 10 seconds and cost me 10 months. Instead, I did something that confused Vivian more than yelling ever could. I went quiet. I stopped posting. I stopped answering phone calls unless I could answer by email. I paid the fines with checks marked paid under protest pending legal resolution, every single one copied and scanned. Then Nora and I started calling neighbors one at a time, not to stir them up, not to ask them to pick sides, just 2 questions. What happened to you? And do you still have the paperwork? Most of them did. People keep humiliation in drawers longer than you would think. The Dorseys had ramp denial letters. The Maters had 7 months of shed emails. Mrs. Harnham had a flagpole notice in a shoebox with Christmas cards. A young couple named Tessa and Malik had been fined for a vegetable garden, while 2 board families had raised beds twice the size. By the end of 2 weeks, we had 9 households quietly documenting everything. Photographs, dates, rainfall, maintenance records, board notices. We did not make speeches. We made copies. Then Owen found the match that lit the whole room. He was reading the original Barton Ridge Declaration, scanned, crooked, and faded. The kind of document nobody reads unless they are either being paid or deeply annoyed. He called me close to midnight and did not say hello. He said, "Dad, Article 12. I told him that was not a greeting. He said, "Listen, Article 12. Paragraph C stated that no board action could remove or materially alter any drainage structure shown on the original site grading plan if that structure served 2 or more lots, and attached to the grading plan, in old block lettering, was a labeled feature called Rook Overflow Swale. My father's berm was not some rogue pile of dirt. It was written into the HOA's own birth certificate. I sat at the kitchen table with that document glowing on my laptop, Nora beside me in her robe, both of us quiet for a long time. Finally she said, "So they never read their own rules?" I said, "Wuss. They fined me for obeying them." The next morning I called Mara Delaney, a real estate attorney in Springfield who had the cheerful voice of a woman who enjoyed bad behavior when it was well documented. She read Article 12, Dr. Keller's report, the county letter, the fines, and Vivian's employer letter, then said, "Caleb, if they touch that berm now, this stops being arrogance and starts becoming personal liability." Mara filed a cease and desist that afternoon, certified, hand-delivered, stamped, logged, beautiful enough to frame if you are the kind of person who frames legal warnings, which apparently I was becoming. She also recorded a notice of pending claim against the HOA common drainage easement, which made their attorney very unhappy because banks and insurers dislike uncertainty almost as much as I dislike ornamental pear trees. 3 days later, the weather shifted. A slow storm system parked west of us, and the forecast called for 4 to 6 inches of rain over one night. Hawthorne Run was already high, the ground already full. The air heavy and green in that old Ozark way that makes Dobbs restless and grown men check gutters twice. I reinforced the berm legally under maintenance rights while the county review was open, added riprap at the toe, checked the spillway, and installed 2 trail cameras aimed only at my property. Miles photographed the board notice board. Tessa logged rain gauge readings. Malik walked the lower cul-de-sac warning folks to move boxes out of crawl spaces just in case. Everything was calm. Everything was documented. And then, on Tuesday morning, while the sky was still bright and too still for comfort, I heard the diesel growl of a flatbed truck pulling toward my back field, and when I stepped onto the porch, I saw a mini excavator chained to the trailer, Vivian's Mercedes behind it, and 3 men in orange vests looking at my father's berm like it was just another job. I walked down slow, not because I felt calm, but because I knew cameras love a man who looks angry and courtrooms love a man who looks reasonable. The foreman was young, maybe 30, polite in that tired contractor way, and when I asked if he had a county land disturbance permit, he looked at Vivian, then looked back at me and said he had a work order from the HOA. I said, "That is not what I asked." Vivian stepped out of the Mercedes wearing cream slacks in a muddy field, which told me everything I needed to know about how much real ground she had ever stood on, and she handed the foreman a board resolution with 3 signatures across the bottom. "This obstruction has been deemed a community hazard," she said, loud enough for the crew to hear. "Caleb is simply upset that the rules apply to him too." I remember smiling then, not a happy smile, more the kind your body makes when your patience is turned into something colder. I called the county drainage office on speaker. No permit had been issued. The review was still open. Mara was already calling the contractor licensing board. The foreman hesitated for almost 40 minutes, engine idling, diesel smoke hanging low in the damp morning air, and I honestly thought common sense might win. Then Vivian walked close enough that I could smell her perfume over the mud and said quietly, "You built your little army, Caleb, but this is still my neighborhood." I looked at her and said, "Vivian, water does not care who chairs the board." She laughed, actually laughed, and told the foreman to proceed. So I stepped back to the surveyed stake, lifted my phone, and recorded as the bucket bit into the berm my father built before Vivian ever learned the word covenant. The first cut made a sound I felt in my teeth. Clay split, stone rolled, the spillway collapsed, and in 47 minutes the structure that had protected 7 families for 4 decades was a raw wound in the earth. Vivian watched the last scoop fall, then rolled down her window and said, "I hope this teaches you when to stop." She drove away before the first cloud covered the sun. After the crew left, I did not chase them, did not post online, did not call her names, though I had a few lined up that would have sounded pretty good in the moment. I moved Nora's car and my truck to the high pan by the barn, called Miles, called Tessa and Malik, called Dr. Keller, called Mara, and then I copied both trail camera cards onto 3 drives. Mara filed for an emergency restraining order at 2018 that afternoon, and she told me the timing mattered because it proved the risk was known before the damage happened. At 4:36, Vivian's attorney emailed Mara saying the HOA had successfully resolved the unauthorized drainage issue and considered the matter closed. Nora read that email at our kitchen table, set the phone down, and said, "That woman just signed her own weather report." It started raining at 6:44, not a gentle rain, not one of those soft spring showers that makes the grass smell sweet, but a hard, flat rain that turned the gravel silver and filled every low place before dark. By 7:15, Hawthorne Run was out of its banks. By 7:40, Malik texted a photo of water crawling under his garage door. Mrs. Harlan had 2 inches in her crawl space. The Dorses moved their son's medical equipment onto the dining table and sent me a picture that made my stomach twist. I stood in my porch in a raincoat with my notebook under my arm, listening to the creek take the path Dr. Keller said it would take, and there is no satisfaction in being right when being right means your neighbors are carrying boxes through ankle-deep water. That part matters. People think revenge feels clean. It does not. It feels like standing dry while people you care about get wet because someone else needed to win. Around 9:25, the secondary flow opened. I saw it on the trail camera feed first. Pale water under infrared, sliding through the breach, spreading east along shallow contour Vivian never bothered to understand. It moved quietly, almost politely, like it had an appointment. 25 minutes later it reached Waverly Hill. Vivian's house sat in a landscaped bowl at the base of her own lawn, beautiful in summer, disastrous in a storm. At 10,008, the first emergency call came from her address. By 10:30, fire trucks were on the hill, their lights flashing red across rain and standing water, and Vivian Carrington, president of the Barton Ridge Commons HOA, was standing on her front steps wrapped in a silver emergency blanket, while 14 inches of water filled her finished lower level, including the wine room she once described at a board meeting as climate-sensitive storage. The local news arrived because flood calls had been coming in all night. The county drainage officer, Alan Briggs, arrived at 11:02 with 2 field techs and a flashlight bright enough to turn rain into white strings. He walked the lower lot, then came to my field, looked at the clean machine cuts in the berm, and got very quiet. I handed him the folder, Dr. Keller's report, Article 12, the county pause letter, the cease and desist, the pending claim notice, the attorney's victory email, and the video from 2 angles. He stood there in the rain watching Vivian's Mercedes headlights reflect off the water below her house. And then he said, loud enough for the news microphone to catch it, "Mrs. Carrington, your board is going to have a hard time calling this an act of God." The next week was not a downfall. It was a collapse. The county issued an emergency stop work order and billed the HOA for temporary drainage repair, erosion control, road cleanup, and sandbag crews. The judge granted Mara's restraining order the next morning. Too late to save the old berm, but right on time to put Vivian's choices into the court record. Owen submitted Miles' saved emails and the enforcement files to the State Civil Rights Division, and what started as my drainage dispute became an investigation into years of selective enforcement. 3 board members resigned in 10 days. Miles became acting president, and the first thing he did was void 18 months of violation letters. Vivian's insurance denied her flood claim because the damage followed the intentional removal of known drainage infrastructure, and that sentence, according to Mara, was the most expensive sentence Vivian ever read. Months later, the management company settled with the affected families. The county recorded a permanent drainage easement across my land, and the berm was rebuilt with engineered stone, a concrete spillway, and enough paperwork to choke a copier. We named the new community watershed fund after my father, not because he wanted recognition. He would have hated the fuss, but because a man who quietly protected people for 40 years deserved more than a memory in a muddy field. And as for Vivian, some folks said she got what she deserved. Some said nobody deserved to watch their home fill with water. And honestly, I still do not know where that line sits. I know she had warnings. I know she had choices. I know she thought power meant never having to listen. But I also know water is a brutal teacher. And sometimes the lesson washes through more than one house. So I will ask you what I still ask myself. Was what happened to Vivian justice, consequence, or just one more tragedy caused by pride? Drop your answer in the comments. Tell me who you think was right, who went too far, and whether a community can ever really heal after neighbors stop trusting the people in charge. And if you have ever dealt with an HOA, a board, a landlord, or anyone who used rules like a weapon, share your story, because somewhere out there is another quiet person with a folder full of receipts, wondering if they are the only one.